Hello again, everyone. Welcome to our Carbonetic YouTube channel and other social networks. Hello, Brent. How are you today?
I'm great, Martin. How are you?
Oh, I'm good. Ready for a beautiful week ahead. And I'm not talking about the weather because it doesn't seems to be that amazing here where I live. But I'm talking about everything of what we have to accomplish and tasks on ends with the
hmm
company. Um, Brent, today we want to address article who got out. I think it's this morning or yesterday regarding the US government embracing carbon offsets despite controversies. So I find it interesting that we can address actually, in your opinion, what are these controversies that the financial refers to? And the good news is that the government is pushing regardless and going in the right direction, supporting actually conservation, supporting actually to protect the forest.
hmm
So, what's your take on this article that got out in the last few hours?
Yeah, I think in general, we see it as a positive sign, and I think what the U.S. government is flagging is that the use of carbon offsets actually has a net positive benefit on forests, and it's not instantaneous change. But really, what they're saying is, look, yes, there are some issues. We think we can address that through guidelines, and we can also get, I think the article states, billions of dollars of capital that's sitting on the sideline and actually get it into doing things that are good for the planet. Um, and we tend to take that same position in Canada in that um, all carbon offsets are generally good, or all carbon offsets IFM projects are good projects. They're not all equally accessible. They're not all equally as reliable. They're going to have their controversies. I think we're getting to the point where we're weeding out most of the sort of abject fraud and getting down to more brass tacks where companies are curious about what they're buying. They have very sophisticated teams to look into what they're buying. So when you see a big body that has the ability to really move the needle for projects like the US government say, hey, you know what, we're going to be okay with these things and we're going to work to help get them to be good, that's a positive thing for us.
Yeah, and it's no different. I think if I'm not mistaken, Brent, we're expecting potentially a change of government here in Canada in 2025. When we look at the polls right now, and again, they're just polls, but we know for a fact that Pierre Poilievre has been asked multiple times what was his view regarding Green Plan. Of course, the conservatives from the west of Canada are way more oriented, to keep on developing oil and gas sector, which we totally agree with, right? Because again, as you said multiple times, what we touch and feel, basically everything of what we consume come from there. So we want to support actually the industry, but we want to make sure they're doing it responsively. And the other end is that Pierre Poilievre from the Conservative Party, which might win the federal election in 2025, has been supporting actually carbon project forest out of west of Canada, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yes, we expect probably a change in government of some description in the U.S. as well.
Yeah.
Um, no doubt. I don't think that either regime will go away completely from offsets because they're identifying that um, that the fire risk is real, that conservation issues, that the smart management of forests is real, and this is something that helps power those changes. It's just dollars invested, and the creating of this new commodity, or not new anymore, but this
Yeah.
new market called carbon offsets, that essentially helps corporates sponsor, take ownership of forests. And I think that's a key differentiation, is that we're not looking for folks to buy offsets. We're looking for partners. We're looking for corporates to roll up their sleeves and get involved through the capital finance of sponsoring land, of sponsoring forests, and then sponsoring the carbon that it sequesters, and making sure that carbon sequestration potential keeps on going because they made a smart investment. So whatever that looks like, hey, we're agnostic to the form. We're interested more in the function. So if we jump back to Canada, thinking about a governmental change, yeah, I mean, we'd love to hear more substance out of the conservative camp. I think we're fiscally conservative as a company, but we're fairly socially conscious because we want to see the right things done in regard to nature and supporting populations, and particularly people, who've been traditionally marginalized by government, through colonialism, our Indigenous partners. So we'd love to see what Polyev has for actual structured plans. But in general, I think what this really signals is an understanding that, take Canada for instance, we've got about 350 to 400 million hectares of forest. And if we really want to get down to brass tacks and say how much of that is managed, that's a very good question. And the answer is probably not all that much.
Yeah.
Because management hasn't really been successful in deflecting mass fire events. Now, scientific community will argue that fires in the boreal forest are very normal. It's a source of renewal. I would agree with that statement. The issue we have is the intensity of the fire, and the fact that we've done sort of forest management by ignoring areas. So if we take, how managed really is a forest if you're not actually putting any effort into it? How managed is a forest if you don't actually know what's there, which is a common occurrence in our business. We spent a lot of money doing forest analysis in an area that is technically a managed forest, where there's no federal or provincial or territorial or specific community area knowledge of what's specifically there. So that's a failing. That's something that carbon projects address. So we actually get some statistics about how much, what the efficacy, what the efficiency, what the performance of a Canadian forest is vis-a-vis carbon sequestration. We don't actually know that's true. It's just some general assumptions based on some math from NRCan that we push out as a statistic, but it's not actually accurate. It's just a generalization because we haven't gone deep with granular knowledge. So we take Fort Nelson, for instance. All around it is a managed forest in theory, but not in practice because there hasn't been any sanctioned harvest there in decades. And in working with the Fort Nelson First Nation and our conversations with them, they actually sought to get cutting permits to go after all the dead and downed timber that had been burnt from last year's wildfires in 2023. And they were not successful in getting their permits until I think just recently, and on the backs of getting their permits for their winter harvest, because in areas like that, harvest should be done in the winter where ground's frozen, access is easier, you can get equipment in and out, you don't have to deal with the sort of the freeze thaw cycle, you just get a nice hard ground surface, and it's really low impact, and it's a really sensitive and responsible way to harvest. They couldn't get a cutting permit from the BC government, even though that is a managed forest and it's technically Fort Nelson First Nation ancestral unceded lands. So how managed is it really, right? And then all of a sudden we get a 50, 60,000 hectare wildfire. The community of Fort Nelson, as well as the community of Fort Nelson First Nation, is evacuated. They're just going to get back to their homes. Today, they're rescinding the evacuation order. So we have this theory about, we've got these managed forests, but it's actually nonsense.
Yeah.
So the counterpoint to that is if we have carbon projects like what Carbon Ethic does, like what Nature's Conservancy does, like what Blue Source does, or companies like South Pole in different areas, I'm not saying everything is perfect, but at least we start to get real data. We start to get real improvement plans. We start to wade through the government bureaucracy and actually get into a place where a stakeholder is actually responsible for the forest and wanting to improve the sequestration potential of that forest and defend against 50, 60,000 hectare wildfires that wipe out communities and houses.
Yeah. And as we said before, there's so much education to be made, and talking about controversies, a lot of people still believe, yeah, well, it gives the right to these emitters actually to emit more because they are paying a tax or they're buying offsets, and at the end of the day, it doesn't help, and which is untrue. It's the reality is that it allows these companies, as you said, to become partners with producers like us and help actually doing spacing, pruning, cleaning, creating biomass, which is good for other different sources of energy and such. So it's really just it allowed these emitters to diversify their activities and bring good actually to the environment as well. So that's the way we like to see it, right?
I agree. Putting people to work in the forest is a good thing. So I was telling you earlier, we had a conversation with one of our trusted contractors who actually worked with us to do some of the forest inventory survey. They spend a lot of effort in the winter doing these wildfire mitigation projects. And he said, the bottleneck for us right now is the fact that we can't find people who actually want to go out and work in the forest. So we've created a whole disconnect in the youth and the culture of people who actually want to go out and make a difference in the forest by doing practical work, like basically pruning trees, picking branches, piling,
Yeah.
doing small scale wildfire mitigation burns, things like that. We need hundreds, if not thousands, of those people across Canada, probably tens of thousands across the planet. So there's this whole ability to generate sustainable economy through small business, like our friends the Sarvers, who are based in 100 Mile, who run these labor crews. He's really focused on building work-life balance because he knows if he has a great crew and he treats them very well and compensates them very well, but also adds things like a 4-day work week and ensuring that people make production bonuses and are really treated like family, then there's a whole option to build another level of economy, where we're struggling for the price of groceries and fuel, things like that. I think the other piece that he identified is that a big bottleneck right now is that communities have actual dollars to spend. Government has actual dollars to spend, and they just can't figure out how to deploy it. So again, this is an example of government bureaucracy saying that something's managed, but not putting any money into the management, or perhaps putting a lot of dollars into the bureaucracy of forest service,
Yeah.
and very little into the actual practice of thinning, pruning, pre-commercial spacing, being intelligent about what's going to happen around communities like Fort Nelson, where you have a zombie fire that could light up because of a dry winter and an early melt, as well as line strikes on hydro lines, which is what actually got the fire going that directly impacted Parker Lake, Fort Nelson. This is just going to continue until we come along and put a stop to it. So the flip side is on the carbon ethic. Let's just say that carbon ethic had a project around Fort Nelson. We would be responsible, and of course we would, through the technology that we've developed, look at the areas of interface. Where are we going to have a fire from? Because if we can prevent wildfire from a traditional sort of 4% per annum in that forest, and we get that down to 3 or perhaps 2.5, it's a massive difference in the amount of carbon that's going into the airshed. So we look at things like that. Hey, are these hydro lines well maintained? If they're not, let's flag that. Let's say, hey, how can we do some smart wildfire protection around those areas? Because we're trying to prevent. How can we look at the Alaska Highway, which is a large area of interface, or any of these other utilities that may not be managing perhaps to specification? How can we improve things? So the point being, in conjunction with our Indigenous partners, we all of a sudden become responsible for large tracts of land where currently somebody who sits in Vancouver Victoria, you can pick a further area away from Fort Nelson than Victoria. I mean, it might as well be the dark side of the moon. People in Victoria have no idea what's even in Fort Nelson, and they don't really care, to be honest. And that's not because they're bad people. It just doesn't connect with them because it's so far removed. And that's why we need local input. So, if we zoom all the way out again, when we talk about, this article in the Post that we've added, the key here is not necessarily in our minds this whole push towards net zero, but promoting, I think what they say is high integrity emissions reductions and channel meaningful amount of capital into nature-based projects.
There you
That's
go.
what it takes, is connecting the finance with groups that care and are able to action that, and then demonstrate that this actually does make the change necessary. And that's really what we're trying to do. So
Yeah, this at the end of the day, the narrative which has been, like flooding all of the media for the last few years was about carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality. To us, at the end of the day, what's important is, hey, can we take care of the forest, which represents the lungs of the planet? And at the end of the day, the carbon offset market is the proper tool to bring capital to do forest management properly, period. And I think this is the right narrative. So I totally agree with you on that. That's my perception of things too. That's my opinion as well.
yeah, and I think we can liken it to, a growing nascent industry. So if we look at cryptocurrencies, for instance, way back when there was this thing called Bitcoin, and for whatever reason, the person or people responsible for it sort of got it right out of the gate. And then we got into the age of speculation and mass adoption, and all the meme coins and all the pump and dump schemes. And now that's really been weeded out, so that people who are investors are really understanding, well, perhaps I'll diversify and I'll take a piece of a Bitcoin ETF or an Ethereum ETF. And so this is the growing up of something that was brand new. And I think that same thing is happening in the voluntary carbon markets, and that's explicitly what this article is talking about, as opposed to the compliance market, which is quite a different animal, and is very, very hyper regulated, I would say, and very authentic and very real and very conservative. And what the government is pushing towards is high quality, high integrity carbon credits that represent real, additional, and permanent emissions reductions. And forcing project proponents to demonstrate that is a very good thing. And as we hold people to account, as technology catches up, we're able to demonstrate that these things actually do make a difference. But that we can never forget, it's that local connection. It's that fact that we're partnered with Fort Nelson First Nation, that we're partnered with Denadelu Council, we're partnered with Ross River First Nation, and places like that, where there is a real meaningful connection to the land. There's real meaningful ongoing data analysis through all the technology that we bring, large commercial drones, connection to satellite data, and actual boots on the ground, putting forest polygons in, measuring trees by hand, essentially wrapping tape measures around, measuring the heights, recording the species and volume, all of that stuff. And then actually looking at fire weather patterns. What's the risk? How can we mitigate against that risk? Is it good for this area to burn? Should we let that be in deference to another area? So that real granular focus on gardening the forest. And so we think that announcements like this are a good thing for Canada. We'd encourage, obviously, we know where the federal government currently stands, where the provincial government currently stands. We'd love to see what perhaps the opposition and maybe government in 2025 stands. But in general, we're going to keep on supporting initiatives like this that allow capital to come to companies like us, so that we can deploy it. And as you said, making the forest better and protecting the lungs of the world.
Yeah, so important and fundamental. Thanks again for sharing, Brent. Always a pleasure. Hopefully the people appreciated, once again, the educational side of what we are providing on our YouTube channel. If you do, please share, please like. It's always appreciated. And see you for the next video, Brent. Have a good week.
You too. Thanks for time.
Bye.